Wow. Thank you, Opal. Thank you. It is such an honor to have one of the amazing co-founders of Black Lives Matters with us today to kick off the road to equal justice. Morning, everybody. My name is Sheldon Himelfarb. I'm the founding CEO of PeaceTech Lab. We're a nonprofit from down the road in Washington, D.C., and we've been focused on peace building and social justice around the world using media, tech, and data for several years now. I'm speaking to you from my home in Southern Maryland, but I was actually born and raised and will always be a Baltimorean. I went to college in the city, so did my daughter, who also went to med school on West Baltimore Street at University of Maryland. Every time I came to visit her, we'd have lunch, grab a sandwich at Lexington Market, and I'm still in Baltimore all the time to see my mom, who is 92. So my connection to the city is as strong as ever, and I can't tell you how happy I am to have this chance to be working together with you. So how, you may ask, does a Baltimore boy come to create something called the PeaceTech Lab? I'm not going to bore you with the whole long journey, but I'll tell you how we began. And it really started some 25 years ago in the country of Rwanda in Central Africa, where I was working shortly after that genocide you may have heard of that occurred in 1984. During that nightmare, radio was the technology of choice, and radio was used to incite the mass killing of 800,000 people in 100 days, mostly Tutsis who were killed by Hutus. And in the wake of that horror, I was fortunate to work with some very courageous men and women at a new radio station that we set up to give people in the region access to reliable information, as well as to give them hope. And most of them working in our station knew someone who had been killed in the genocide. And I will never forget asking one of them, a Tutsi journalist. I'll never forget asking this man who had buried his brother how he felt working with Hutus. And he told me that it was the only way to get peace. He said he would do anything to bring peace to his community and to his country. And he said he just wanted our help to do it. He just needed some help. I left there committed to figuring out ways to do just that, committed to putting the right tools into the hands of people like him who were dedicated to peace building and social change. And I've been doing it ever since with the help of a great team at the lab who you will get to know across the next 3 weeks. So that's how it started. Now, fast forward about 25 years, and here we are, 2020, a very, very painful year in the US. COVID-19 has crippled the country. It's illuminated the injustices of our healthcare system, as we've witnessed African Americans dying from the virus at twice the national average. We watched as the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery in February, Breonna Taylor in March, and George Floyd in May sparked protests and outrage and ignited calls for racial justice, not just here, but around the globe. And as an organization that cares deeply about equity and using technology as a force for social good, we at the PeaceTech Lab truly feel the weight of responsibility to help answer these calls for justice as best we can. Over the years, we have been able to provide more than 1,400 peace builders in 25 countries with tools and training so that they could better tackle their most pressing local challenges. And now it's time we bring our lessons home and take part in the collective mission that you all are engaged in to create social change here. And that's why we're launching the Road to Equal Justice in Baltimore today. And Baltimore will be the first in a line of US cities, including Minneapolis, Portland, and Louisville, where we're going to offer this virtual training. Hopefully we'll get to start doing them in person later next year. Training on using tech, media, and data, as you heard from Opal, to advance issues of social justice. And in each city, our goal is to connect local organizations that are focused on economic justice, criminal justice reform, fair housing, education, racial equity, voting rights, and more, and empower them with training and resources to amplify their messages and scale their operations so they can do more, better, faster of the great work they're already doing. That's what we call putting the right tools into the right hands to build peace through justice. So let me tee up what you can expect over the next 3 weeks. Somebody want to pull up the schedule slide? Great, thank you. Thanks, Tim. Today, as you can see from that first bullet, we're going to be discussing some of the key issues facing Baltimore with the people who know these best, you. And then we've got Dayvon Love from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and I cannot tell you how honored I am that we are working with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle here. We'll have Dayvon Love joining us shortly to get us all involved in this session called When Baltimore Awakens. Later this morning, we'll look at media, tech, and data platforms that are moving the fight for racial justice forward and what the data is saying about Baltimore. Next Friday, the 23rd there, is going to include hands-on training on media campaigns, digital surveys, data analysis, visualization, social media mapping, and digital security tools. It's a lot. But fortunately, we've got one of these training sessions being led by Melvin Cedino from Baltimore's own Smart Logic. He'll help us understand how to effectively use messaging apps to organize and communicate. And then finally, on Friday, April 30th, and you'll want to pay attention to this, Fearless, the technology company from downtown Baltimore, is going to lead the discussion on the best ways to incorporate new tools into your organization. And then the lab, PeaceTech Lab, will award grants. Hope you heard that, folks. We will be awarding grants for innovative projects. We'll also provide software licenses and get everyone engaged on networking platforms so we can all stay connected beyond our sessions together. So let me just stop there by thanking all of you for attending today, as well as the future sessions, and thank you even more so for the tireless work that you are already doing on behalf of the city and the people of Baltimore, of which I feel a part. Now, I am super excited to welcome today's keynote speaker, DeRay McKesson. DeRay is a civil rights activist who was also born and raised in Baltimore, I was pleased to hear. DeRay, I might say that maybe you and I played sports against each other in high school, except you weren't born when I was in high school. So I don't think that happened. But DeRay was outraged by the death of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and was a force in those protests as well as in many more since. And DeRay has just become a key voice in the work to confront the systems and structures that have led to mass incarceration and police killings of Black and other minority populations. We in the lab got to know him first as the host of the award-winning weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which I love because it creates space for conversation about the most important issues of the week related to justice, related to equity and identity. He's a board member of Rock the Vote. He's been named one of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine and one of the 30 most influential people on the internet by Time magazine. And I cannot be more honored to introduce to you DeRay McKesson. Ladies and gentlemen, DeRay. You're on mute, DeRay.
Hey everybody, it's good to be here. Not only am I from Baltimore, but I live in Mount Vernon by the Bun Shop off Reed Street. So that's a Baltimore Remains home. It's good to be here. You know, Pod Save the People, we started it a couple years ago as a place where we could have conversations about news that people didn't know about solutions, having activists on that wouldn't be on other national platforms because they wouldn't be invited. And it's been really powerful to see the move. But when I zoom out, I'm reminded that so much of this work is about telling the story, about helping people understand what's true and what's not true, so that then they can be primed to take action. And technology is a key part of that. Technology allows us to get and build community in ways that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to. It allows us to accelerate the pace of reaching out to people, spend a lot of time actually trying to figure out what the data is, or how do we use data that is not numbers, but people's stories and lives to inform it. I think about, you know, the police kill about 1,100 people a year. What a lot of people don't realize is the police actually kill more people in suburban communities than almost all other communities combined. It's not cities, right? And we think about Maryland, Baltimore County police actually killed more people last year than all other police departments combined. When we look at the last year of SWAT team data, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Anne Arundel County actually deployed the SWAT teams more than Baltimore City. So like, technology can help us understand and pinpoint where problems are so that we can be really focused about what the solutions are. And that's really powerful. You know, I think about Twitter, Twitter was very big for us when we were in the street in Ferguson. Twitter was big when we were in the street in Baltimore. That Twitter has actually been a huge platform for organizing across the country. But we know that technology rarely, if ever, replaces offline organizing. That there will always be a need to like continue to build community with people around you, in front of you. Like that actually just is an important part of the work, and that doesn't go away. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, I'm always mindful too that changing the conversation does not necessarily change the outcomes. That we are talking about race and justice in ways that, you know, we haven't talked about in decades. When you look at the numbers though, we're reminded that the police actually killed more people this year than last year. That there was no dip during quarantine, lockdown, COVID, the protests. Like there was actually no decrease at all. So it's a reminder that like talking about it is a huge first step, that you can't fight what you can't name. But that's just not enough. So when I think about the city, you know, the city of Baltimore is a great example. I was a youth organizer when I was 16. I helped lead Youth as Resources. I opened up an after school center on the west side of Baltimore. I worked in the school system as the chief human capital. And I'll tell you that the outcomes today in the city around children, youth, and families look the same, if not, or similar, if not the exact same than they did when I was 16. That like we have dumped money into places and we've done everything but actually fix the structure. That the nonprofit community in Baltimore has tried its best to sort of, you know, hold the city up. But until City Hall and like the legislature actually invest in community in a structural way, like the outcomes will be stuck. And part of our work is to build the case, help people to run for office, like do all of that so that the structure actually changes in the city, because people deserve something much better than what they have today. So I'm excited about PeaceTech. I'm excited to see what happens. You know, there's so much energy in the city. There's so much talent in the city. And part of organizing is reminding people that you always have power, that organizers can't give you power. What organizers can do is help give you tools to access that power. It can help you see tools and help expose you to resources, because the power you've had is already there. Like nobody gave that to you. You already had that. And the city of Baltimore reminds me of a place often where we just need to press to get the change that we deserve, because it's on the horizon. And I feel really good about that. So I'm excited. I'm excited that PeaceTech is coming to the city, Sheldon. I'm excited that there will be a host of people who have access to resources that they might not other have had. And I'm excited that they'll be a part of a network of people across the country who can support.
Thank you, DeRay. This is Tim Receiver. I'm the Director of Programs at PeaceTech Lab, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Really appreciate it. I was just watching an interview that you gave with the Colbert Report. It's been a few years, but the one thing you said was the difference between the civil rights movement in the 60s and the civil rights movement now is the role of technology. And, you know, looking at the landscape, that, you know, definitely that is the focus of the next 3 weeks that we have.
Yeah, think about, you know, we just have access to tools that they didn't have, right? That like I can talk to 1 million people whenever I want to. I can talk to people in different states whenever I want to. We can Zoom like that. Like we just have tools that they didn't have. And we learned so many lessons from the way they fought, who they fought, like the plans that they had and strategies. And the internet allows us to scale those things in ways that were just different to them. You know, you think about what it meant to have to wait for the news to come on to get a message out. The news is a nice to have for us. It's not a necessity. But what is true, right? And this is why offline organizing never disappears, is that we don't own any of these tools, right? I don't own Twitter. I don't own Instagram. Black people don't own that stuff. And if that disappears tomorrow, we're like, you know, then what? Which is why, like, offline organizing will always have to be a key to this. The online organizing helps expand, it helps create community, all those things. But you know, you've seen when the platforms get hard, or when you don't feel safe on the platform, or like, then if that's the only place you organize, then you're stuck. You know, I think about Twitter. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned from raising money to try and get me killed. And like, there was a point where like Twitter wasn't always like the safest place, but I'm still there. It's just different how I'm there. But you know, what if that was the only place that I had community? Like, then I'm sort of screwed. So we think about the internet as an important way to buttress and augment and enhance the work of organizing. I never think about it as a way to replace it, but we also think about these relationships that you build online as authentic, right? That like, I've been connected to tons of people that I never would have known at all, if not for the internet. You know, just organizing in Baltimore County around the Baltimore County police legislation that just passed is like, one of the dopest organizers I was with was a 17-year-old who just graduated from, she just graduated from high school. And like, she had one of the best analyses. She understood the landscape really well. I went to high school in the county, like she got it. And we would have never been in a community together if not for technology.
Yeah, that's amazing. And even looking at what you were doing in Ferguson with Twitter and just keeping that struggle, you know, alive in the media, you know, through your activism on Twitter was really inspiring. So yeah, thank you again for your time, for joining us. I'm so glad that we were able to get you for the time here. But some of the things that we'll be doing in the next week, today we're going to look at some of the platforms on racial justice around the U.S. and what they're, you know, how they're already handling these issues, and then what the data is showing in Baltimore. But next week we're going to be doing a lot of hands-on training, you know, with messaging apps, with social media apps, with mapping, with digital security tools. And so that's, you know, I think it kind of fits into some of your passions as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. I can't wait to loop back at the end to see how the learning was. But, you know, especially in the city, when we look at everything that we could track is disproportionately impacting people of color. Like, there's not one metric that we can track. So the question becomes like, what do we do to fix it, right? Like, how do we fix it at the root level, not in one neighborhood, not in two neighborhoods, but all of the neighborhoods? And what would it take? And I think that part of that dreaming, because, you know, like the way the city has worked is that we sort of target, like, you know, there are all these communities I didn't even know existed, like Locust Point, all those places. Like, when I was a kid, I didn't even know Locust Point was a place. I'd never been on that side of the, I mean, I've been right across the harbor, but I didn't know all those communities were back there. Like, all those places that are like, you know, it's all white essentially in like a very different part of the city. And then you look at places like parts of the Alameda, or you look at, you know, I grew up Poplar Grove and Pressbury, and like the neighborhood I grew up in looks just like it did when I was 10. And that means something, right? That like the city has made choices, and how do we actually highlight those things and sort of push and put together a plan that people can get behind that's like, we deserve this.
Yeah, and I think if people stick around to the very last presentation of today, we're looking at opportunity insights, and they have all those metrics for different neighborhoods in Baltimore, and you can see that, you know, that the racial breakdown, the age breakdown, the economics, you know, and you can see exactly what you're talking about there. And this is a great segue, because we have Dayvon Love from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle that's going to be working with us over the next hour and a half or so to dig into some of these issues in Baltimore and some of the opportunities that exist, and getting people involved in the conversation. Dayvon is he is the co-founder of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and he's also the director of public policy. The mission statement of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is a grassroots think tank which advances the public policy interests of Black people in Baltimore through youth leadership development, political advocacy, and autonomous intellectual innovation. Thanks for joining us today, Dayvon, and please feel free to take it away. I have your slides.
All right, appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity. So I was asked, LBS was asked to do a presentation really to try to ground the conversation as it relates to some of the work that we've done around racial justice. And one of the places where we've actually spent a lot of time is really the notion of the nonprofit industrial complex. And what we have done is expanded that to an analysis of the human social service sector. So what I'm going to talk about today is a summary of a publication that we produced about a year ago called When Baltimore Awakes. So just to give you kind of a big picture of, well, first let me tell you about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and then I'll come back to the publication. We're a grassroots political think tank. We've done political advocacy in Baltimore for many years. We were founded in 2010. One of our first major efforts was around stopping the construction of a $104 million juvenile detention facility. So LBS and many other organizations were involved in that effort. And we've since done a lot of criminal justice related advocacy in the state legislature and in City Hall. And so we've done a variety of different legislative activities where, whether it's, work on pretrial reform and trying to, change the cash bail system, police, community oversight of law enforcement, which is some of the work that we're doing now. We were a part of a coalition to develop a Black Arts and Entertainment District on Pennsylvania Avenue, and that work is currently ongoing. So there are a variety of different kinds of work that we've done over the course of time. So in circling back to the when Baltimore Awakes. When Baltimore Awakes is a play off of a 1920 book written by Hubert Henry Harrison called When Africa Awakes. In that book, Hubert Henry Harrison was criticizing many of the folks who saw themselves as friendly to the struggle that Black people faced and continue to face here in the United States and around the world. And it was criticisms of folks that in many respects aren't used to being called out for the ways in which they perpetuate racism and white supremacy. And so the reason why I want to give this kind of lead into the summary of this publication that we put out is because one of the things that's generally very hard for people to understand is how it is that people whom want to help, people who want to do good, can actually be the biggest problem in trying to address many of these issues. Many of the institutions that are tasked with improving the quality of life of Black people, many of those institutions have ways of operating that actually perpetuate systems of white supremacy. Many of the nonprofits and social programs, because I think a lot of times what happens is they get described as imperfect. And what I'm going to argue to you today is that, in fact, it's not just that these programs are imperfect. It's not just that there isn't enough resources invested in the community. I think that's a part of the problem. But a central piece is that many of the institutions tasked, whether we're talking about education, social work, public health, many of the institutions and industries that are tasked with improving the quality of life of Black people actually are oppressive systems that do more harm than good. And so that's going to be the general thrust. All right, so we ready? We have the slideshow ready? All right, we can go to the next slide. So this is a quote that actually begins the paper. This is a quote from Frantz Fanon. If you're not familiar, Frantz Fanon was an Algerian psychologist, or he was a psychiatrist rather, during the Algerian Revolution. He's well known amongst those who are learned in issues of colonialism and anti-colonial struggles for national liberation. This is a quote that comes from Black Skin, White Mask, which is, kind of his first major text. And what he's describing in this particular quote is the way in which when you think about the project of European domination of the world, right, which is, you know, which has been a 400 to 500 year process, that the ravages of colonialism and white supremacy have an impact on the way that people relate to the world. And in fact, there is a dehumanizing element to much of the kind of colonial and white supremacist conquests that really constitute much of what governs the world. And there's a way in which, particularly those with kind of a more missionary orientation towards non-white peoples of the world, Fanon is describing the way in which particularly people of African descent become what he calls an insurance on white folks' collective humanity, right? That when you know, and so this is kind of, it kind of sets the stage and kind of gives a paradigm for how we are to think about just the way in which racism and white supremacy operates and how deep it is. Next slide. So the human social service sector, there are three major elements that make the human social service sector an industry that perpetuates white supremacy. One is that it perpetuates the notion of the inherent pathology of Black people, right? So I'm gonna talk about what that means. So many of the images and representations that are most highly circulated about people of African descent are images and narratives that frame Black people primarily as people in need of services, right? As problems to be fixed, right? And even folks who are well-meaning, right? If you, for instance, were to look up much of the social science research on Black people as a people, you will find that most of what you'll find are studies studying pathologies amongst Black people, right? And so because of this notion of the inherent pathology of Black people, because of this notion of Black people primarily being understood as recipients of services and a problem to be fixed, it creates a context where the collective American consciousness is such that Black folks as a people get rendered as a people where pathology is inherent. So that's important because when an institution or a program is rooted in that perspective, there are real concrete consequences as to how programs are designed, and that program design can perpetuate white supremacy. And we'll talk more about that later. Next slide. The second is that in the mainstream human social service sector, right? Again, we're talking education, social work, public health, you know, out of school time, nonprofit, youth service. A lot of times what happens is that there's a marginalization of methodologies of human service that are rooted in the cultural and intellectual resources of people of African descent and other people of color, right? So when you think about how teachers are prepared to teach, the methodologies, because all of us, you know, if you're a professional and you're engaged in professional activity, you have a methodology, a template as to how you do certain things. And there are methodologies that have been deployed by folks of African descent and other folks of color that should be resources used that folks study as a part of developing approaches to serving our community. But what happens is that, you know, major white institutions have essentially established themselves as experts on Black people, right? And in fact, one thing that you'll hear some folks who kind of share the perspective that LBS has is that there are folks from whom see themselves as knowing more about our community than we know about ourselves, right? And so again, this frames out the kinds of methodologies of human service that come out of the bodies of work that are produced by peoples of African descent. They're independent of the mainstream. And again, we'll go deeper into that. Next slide. And then the third piece that makes the human social service sector a purveyor of white supremacy is that the leadership of these institutions oftentimes are not representative of the people they serve. So when you think about, for instance, like many major nonprofits have corporate boards, and those boards are not accountable to the communities that are being served, but they're formally and structurally accountable to the corporate sector, right? And so in many respects, many of these institutions and programs actually are serving corporate interests, and really the community's interest is just to the side. And again, we'll talk more about that. Next slide. All right, so the first section of the report, it establishes, and so this is something that's going to be very important for people to be clear about, is that we live in a society that is structured on racism and white supremacy. And this is a sociological fact. This is not something that is a matter of conjecture. When you look at every index for quality of life, Black folks are at or near the bottom. Whites are generally better off in those indexes of quality of life than folks of color, generally. And so when we talk about the system of white supremacy, we're talking about a system that is ubiquitous, but a system from whom the outcomes of the way that civil society is organized is predicated on this notion and the system of white supremacy. And again, this is a sociological fact. And one of the things I say in the publication is, if you're at a place where you're still struggling with that, then there's just an entirely different conversation that needs to be had. But we start from the premise that we agree that the existence of the system of white supremacy is just true in our society. Next slide. There are a couple of things that, in terms of understanding the system of white supremacy, that are important to recognize. One is that it's the importance of the invisibility of the system of white supremacy, right? So one of the ways that the system of white supremacy perpetuates itself is that it's so ubiquitous. There's a quote, and I'm forgetting where the quote comes from in the moment, that an all-pervasive environment is beyond perception, right? So it's like, a fish in water will have a hard time perceiving the water itself because it's everywhere. White supremacy is that ubiquitous, and a part of how it maintains itself is the way in which, for many folks, it's beyond perception. And so I talk about the importance of the way in which the invisibility of white supremacy helps perpetuate it. And then also there are political and professional consequences in many institutional contexts for calling it out. One of the things that I mentioned, and this is kind of under that Frantz Fanon quote, is I talk about the way in which the system of white supremacy, Hubert Henry Harrison, I mentioned him earlier, he also wrote a collection of essays in a book called Negro in the Nation. And he describes that the change from chattel slavery to wage slavery, right, which is the transition that happened after the Civil War, was slavery enforced by brute force. And now we're in a kind of slavery that is enforced by starvation. And so we talk about the ways in which, people's livelihoods are often weaponized, right, and used as a way to impose consequences, political and professional consequences against those who raise the issue of white supremacy in the system and how it operates. Next slide. So we talked about the notion of Black pathology. And so just to go a little deeper here and to talk about how the impact that this actually has. So, part of the issue with this notion of inherent Black pathology is that when a people is understood to be inherently violent, criminal, unable to be able to, solve its own problems and address its own needs, programs are then designed from this perspective, right? And so what happens is that many of the human service institutions, nonprofit organizations, they design their programs in such a way that it cultivates the community being dependent on outside institutions for its ability to be self-sustaining. this is particularly important because, and one of the analogies that I use is that in some respects, Black folks are represented in these institutional arrangements the same way that people relate to their pets, right? Where you're not equal to your pets, but there's a kind of notion of the kind of need Black people as a people as kind of the helpless people that need outside institutions in order for it to thrive. And going back to what I said earlier, being primarily understood as recipients of services, it forms how programs are structured. There are two quotes that I'll mention that come out of the publication that I think are particularly useful. I quote a grad student in 1970 who actually wrote a reflection on their experience doing social science research, and what Davidson describes, he says this notion of the liberal academic colonizer, where there are many volumes that are produced about Black oppression. And there's a notion that this is somehow a way of exposing or helping raise awareness about the oppression of Black people. And he argues what it actually does, it reinforces the kind of plethora of volumes about Black oppression actually create this environment that affirms the notions that people have about Black people, again, as inherently pathological. Andrew Billingsley, who was a very prominent Black sociologist in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he served a key role in criticizing the Moynihan Report. This is a report that was produced in the mid-1960s by Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who at the time was the labor secretary. And he produced a report where it was supposed to be a description of the problems that Black people face. And Moynihan described Black people as our communities as a tangle of pathology. Andrew Billingsley, again, a Black sociologist, was one of the chief folks who criticized Moynihan. And what he said was actually the pathology that Moynihan is describing comes not from this so-called tangle of pathology for Black people. It comes from the systems of racism and white supremacy that create the conditions that produce the circumstances that we see today, right? And so this is Dr. Billingsley pushing back against the way in which Patrick Daniel Moynihan, someone who's actually very well respected and well regarded in the fields of social science, pushing back against the way in which he carried this notion of Black folks as being inherently pathological. Next slide. In fact, so some of the other material that I quote, and this is, again, Andrew Billingsley kind of making an observation of the landscape, where he quotes two white sociologists who did what they refer to as a 9-month sojourn in the Black community. And the research product they produced as a result of having spent a bunch of time amongst Black people is, quote, there are virtually no pluses in ghetto Negro culture, right? So this is a part of the narrative, the worldview, the paradigm, right, of many of the thought leadership within the human social service sector, which is that Black people can only be understood in terms of pathology. You may have individual Black people that are understood as exceptional or special, but as a people, this notion that there are virtually no pluses. Just, a story that I think helps illustrate this. I remember doing a presentation years ago, and it was about, our critique of the nonprofit industrial complex. And so it was a pretty big audience in attendance. And there was a debate against a gentleman who, I respect, a white gentleman whom I respect on these issues. And at the time he had, run a youth program. And so I remember during Q&A, there was a Black student who was probably 16 or 17 at the time. And the question of me was, Dayvon, why is it that, you all are so hard on folks that want to help us? And the student says, I see Black people as the way that I see like a drug addict, where we can't get out of this on our own. We need other people to be able to help us get out of the condition that we're in. We don't have the ability ourselves. And so I asked the student a question. I said, well, you described some of the problems Black people have, but what are some of the gifts that Black folks have as a people? And the student had a hard time answering that question. And the point that I made was that's the point, is that people of African descent as a people actually have assets that are useful not just to Black people, but to larger human society. But because many of us are only able to see Black folks as inherently pathological, we almost take off the table the ability to tap into some of those intellectual and cultural resources that people of African descent produce. So that's really the implication of what these white sociologists kind of came out of with this quote of there being no pluses in so-called ghetto Negro culture. And then this notion of false empathy, which is a part of this notion of Black pathology. So I mentioned the pet metaphor. And so there are ways in which certain types of empathy that are rooted in this notion of Black pathology actually affirm notions of Black inferiority, right? And I give a couple of examples. One example I give is Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who's a really highly venerated African-centered scholar, talks about his experience as a young person working for a older white man who had a pretty extensive library. And Dr. Clarke once asked, this white man that he was working for at the time, this is like in the 1920s and 30s, he asked them if he had any books on the ancient history of the Negro race. And he says that this gentleman says to him in a very kind way, I'm sorry, John, but you come from a race of people that have no ancient history, right? That's an example of what false empathy is about. Because it's not that the gentleman that Dr. Clarke was talking to as a kid meant any ill harm or ill will towards him, right? But it's that his empathy was rooted in this notion that Black folks don't have any ancient history. And we'll talk later about why that is particularly important. Next slide. All right, so methodologies of liberation. So this is the third section of the publication. So let me actually extend a little bit on this piece around the importance of ancient African history. So I've talked about this notion of inherent Black pathology. When you think about larger civil society, one of the fundamental elements of this, kind of white supremacist society that is an extension of the project of European domination, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke also once said, is that there wasn't just a physical colonization of the world, but colonization of ideas about the world. And that many of us in our kind of educational training are never taught about the ways in ancient African civilizations provided the world with much of the modern technologies. And so a part of what happens is, in the story that I usually tell to illustrate the point, I remember, when I was a debate coach, still fairly young, had, an analysis of racism and white supremacy, talking to a gentleman, an older gentleman, who was really learned in African history, who said to me, Dayvon, Europeans were traveling the Atlantic Ocean and traveling the ocean in general before Europeans were. And my first instinct was to say, why we always have to have these conspiracy theories of Black people doing stuff first, makes us look bad. That was my first instinct. And then I happened to come across a YouTube video of a lecture of a man named Ivan Van Sertima called They Came Before Columbus. And then I eventually went and got the book. And there are two conclusions that I came to. The first was that Africans certainly were navigating the oceans before Europeans were. African people have the oldest civilizations. And in fact, the Moors, when you think about the whole thing around the debate in early European history about whether the world was flat or round, the Moors of East Africa were clear about that, and that's where the Portuguese, you know, and many folks in Spain got the idea, the world being round. So it's certainly true that Africans would travel an ocean. But the other thing I had to ask myself is, why was I so willing to be dismissive of this idea that Africans were navigating the ocean? And the conclusion that I came to was that even as a person enlightened or conscious about the system of white supremacy, I had never been exposed to narratives of people of African descent operating arenas marked as high levels of civilization, right? I'd never been exposed to those narratives, right? So if you've never been exposed to a narrative of people of African descent operating in these arenas marked as high levels of civilization, then it creates a context where your ability to imagine peoples of African descent as anything other than as a people in need of other folks to lift us up become a very natural, rational belief. And in many respects, the marginalization of the kinds of narratives of African people that I've just described is part and parcel of how the notion of Black pathology perpetuates itself. The way that this bridges to a conversation about methodologies of liberation is because there are methodologies of, you know, whether you're talking about reproductive systems of reproductive health, you know, systems, as I just mentioned, of navigation, you know, of medicine, of, you know, human development. There are methodologies that come out of non-Western civilizations and cultures, or that have been kind of developed in kind of independent, you know, Black spaces that are often marginalized from mainstream institutional contexts. And so we have currently are methodologies of human service that perpetuate notions of white supremacy. There are three elements that make a methodology an example of a white supremacist methodology. The first is the false notion of objectivity. So what I'm sure many of you have heard of this notion of evidence-based practice, right? And this is kind of over the past 10 to 15 years or so, the emergence of this whole notion of evidence-based practice. And it's important to be clear that this doesn't mean that evidence isn't good or that evidence is bad. But the way in which notions of evidence-based practice are deployed, they're deployed in ways that conceal certain inherent biases about what constitutes good practice that are rooted in many of these notions of Black pathology and notions of white supremacy. But what it does is it allows mainstream institutions to control like what constitutes effective, legitimate methodology under the guise of science. And so a part of, you know, folks who are wanting to address this notion of false objectivity and push back against the kind of, you know, the tyranny of evidence-based practice is to have the conversation about what constitutes evidence, right? What constitutes the evidence that would make a methodology effective. So that's the first piece. The second is that any approach or methodology that deals with an individual people outside of their communal or cultural context. So, you know, and I've seen firsthand many youth serving programs that deal with the youth that they deal with as individual people in some contexts in ways that cause the young person to see their own community as pathological and cause them to see their ascendance to success as directly being connected to their ability to create social and literal distance from their communal and cultural context from which they come. So when you deal with a person as an individual outside of their communal cultural context, right, it creates a dynamic where the individual person is valorized in ways that make their community and render their community pathological, as opposed to seeing that person in the context of their community and making it a key part of how services are delivered. And then third, drawing on material that has Eurocentric intellectual resources as a part of it. So this is like, I'm sure a lot of people now are hearing about, you know, wanting to take Columbus out of the curriculum, right? Which is, I think, particularly important and helping to then reframe the kinds of, concepts that are made available to people, whether it's in the field of education or other kinds of youth-serving contexts, or just in general, the general public. It's important that we're able to shift our ideas about people of African descent and people of color more broadly. But you can't do that if you're drawing from intellectual material that uses the same kind of racist distortions that produce a lot of what we've been talking about thus far. Next slide, please. Part of the issue with methodologies of liberation is that there's often an arrogance in mainstream white institutions. And in Baltimore, whether it's Johns Hopkins, it's School of Public Health, it's Urban Health Institute, it's School of Education, whether you're talking about University of Maryland School of Social Work, these are major institutions that have been able to be the gatekeepers of what constitutes best practice. And so there's an arrogance because many of the folks who are designated as experts on Black oppression are folks who have not studied the history and culture of peoples of African descent as a result of all the things I mentioned before about this notion of inherent Black pathology. So it is this arrogance, right, that creates a context where much of the kinds of alternative methodologies are ignored. So I give an example, for instance, of African-centered rites of passage, which is something that is actually fairly popular in certain, Black spaces, where it's a process that uses African culture to help socialize Black folks from childhood to adulthood. Most cultures have a process for this. Many cultures have a process for how you socialize children in such a way, and you design their socialization into adulthood that is effective, that helps them be self-sustaining, et cetera. And so this is an example of a kind of practice of a methodology of human service or human development that is often marginalized. I also mentioned in the paper, the Nation of Islam, which is a controversial organization for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that, many folks who are not, and I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam, people who have studied it, and when you study the impact that it had on its members, if you take out the religious aspect of it, you take out the politics of it, and you just look at it as a template for human development. For instance, when you look at the way in which the Nation of Islam is able to be one of the most effective organizations at doing character development and reform within the prisons, and their ability to attract folks within the prisons. For me, folks who are serious, particularly about the issue of Black men and boys, which has become kind of a major issue within the human social service sector, should study that methodology and study it as a methodology of human development and borrow from it the aspects that could address, the ways in which, how to address the issues of human socialization for Black folks. And then the Black helping tradition, which is basically a approach to social work that uses a lot of the kind of built-in spiritual aspects of Black culture and tradition to deal with trauma and grief and suffering. So again, these are just examples of alternative methodologies that if you go in mainstream spaces, again, the examples I gave, these are alternative methodologies that are not respected because of the arrogance that comes as a result of the way that white supremacy programs a lot of our thinking. But it is these alternative methodologies that if they had the resources behind them and they had the kind of institutional backing as legitimate ideas and approaches, would have a tremendous impact on Baltimore and the community. Next slide. And then the last section is the confrontation. And so, there's a real political economy to this conversation. I talk about the notion of incorporated resistance. So we're in a moment now where there are lots of people that are going to use the term racial equity. There's more people who are willing to use the term white supremacy, or people talking about structural racism. And the best way that I've heard to describe this notion of incorporated resistance is to say, you can talk all that Black stuff, just come to work tomorrow, right? Where the rhetoric and discourse around racial justice can be used but the structures of the institutions are able to remain the same. And, you know, one of the biggest things I would hope that you would get from our conversation is the way in which this incorporated resistance poses such problems and challenges to actually addressing the issues that we face. Because in many respects, there are ways in which people will use the rhetoric of racial justice, but will structure particularly the human social service sector in such a way that maintain its oppressive elements. And there's often an avoidance of the confrontation of these ideas. So the ideas that I'm breaking up and that we put in this publication, When Baltimore Awakes, are not new. I draw from a lot of research and ideas and conversations and other publications that have been put out for a long time. But there's an avoidance in actually confronting these ideas, because there are folks whose livelihoods are dependent, and this, you can go to the next slide. There are folks whose livelihoods are dependent on this arrangement. There are people who benefit from the way in which the suffering of Black folks is an industry, from their folks that profiteer off of this industry. And again, this goes back to what I said in the beginning. There's a way in which people who see themselves as doing good have a hard time with this material because they see themselves as, well, how could I possibly be a problem if I just want to do good? And often what I say is that, you know, like anything else, you know, if you were doing a party at your house and I showed up and I just started doing stuff, you would stop me and say, whoa, 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 what are you doing? You know, you're messing up what I have going on. And if I were to say, well, I'm just trying to do good, you would say, no, you should ask, you should consult. Like, I have the ability to tell you what it is we need. You know, but a part of what we see a lot of times is folks that just decide they want to do good, not recognizing that there are ways in which you can actually do harm. The other piece is that there are ways in which notions of personal experience and expertise oftentimes get conflated. So one of the things I'm hearing now a lot more is this idea that as a Black person, my personal experience makes me an expert on race. And if you hear that, it's important that you're clear that while I'm an expert on my own experience, systems of white supremacy and racism are systems that require rigorous study. So just having a Black person talk to you about racism is not enough. But it's important that folks establish what is the level, and expertise doesn't necessarily flow from having to go to school or get degrees. But it is to say that it's important that just merely having a Black person with an opinion is not expertise, right? It's important that folks establish their expertise on particular subjects that relate to Black people, because there's so much to know. And so that's particularly important. And then one of the things that I end on is the importance in shifting thought leadership. The human social service sector operates with an architecture, a kind of institutional and intellectual architecture that I've kind of laid out the dynamics of it over the course of this presentation, that is held up by thought leadership, key people in key positions within many of these institutions that are gatekeepers of what is legitimate and what isn't. And so the confrontation that I'm describing is one where we have to hold the current thought leadership of the current arrangement accountable for their failures in the human social service sector. Because again, it's not just merely there hasn't been enough money invested in the community. It is that the money that has come, quote unquote, to the community didn't actually make it to the community. And the money that did make it to the community made it to the community in ways where there are institutional arrangements that deliver services in ways that cultivate the dependence of folks of African descent in Baltimore on these institutions. And they're merely doing one of the terms I use in the paper is they're doing what I call disaster management, which is they're just managing oppression. They're managing the suffering. They're managing the kind of conditions that exist in many areas of the Black community. and in other communities, they're managing suffering. And that's really the basis of the way in which the human social service sector operates. And we have to then hold the thought leadership of this industry accountable for their failure in addressing these issues and perpetuating methodologies that hold up the system of white supremacy. So I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so that's the last slide. So if there are any questions, I know there was a lot of material in a short amount of time. The publication itself was about 25,000 words or so. So it's very long, it's very extensive. So there was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I guess the way that I'll summarize it is that, you don't have to teach a worm what to do to survive, right? It knows what it needs to extract from the world what is necessary to perpetuate its species. And inherent in its ability to survive are the things it needs to be able to perpetuate itself. And what has happened with people of African descent is that the kind of societal assault on the humanity of people of African descent have gutted from our collective communal context the kinds of self-perpetuating, self-sustaining institutions that allow us to do the forms of human socialization that are important for any group of people. And the human social service sector, as it has taken up the responsibility really since the 1960s for socializing large elements of our community, whether it is in the prison system, whether it's public education, whether it's human social service system. These are institutions that essentially took over the responsibility for socializing the community. And what that has resulted in is a gutting of the kind of inherent natural disposition towards being self-sufficient, towards respecting our own kind of cultural mores and technologies of human development that are inherent in any kind of functional group of people. And so a part of these alternative methodologies is investing in an ecosystem of Black folks that is controlled and operated by the masses of our community that are able to position ourselves to solve our own problems. Because what is fundamental to the current system is that Black people are understood as a problem to be fixed instead of a solution to our own problems. And it is only when we are understood as solutions to our own problems and not as a problem to be fixed, that there will be a genuine transformation in the conditions that we see plaguing many communities in Baltimore. So I'll stop there, and if there are any questions or comments or even pushback, I welcome it.
Thank you for that, Dayvon. Elena says this was such a clear and powerful presentation, and there's a question from the audience around process. So how does LBS set up discussions on issues like economic disparities or criminal justice reform? What is the process for that?
Well, I mean, it's nothing in particular. We, like I mentioned before, there are lots of projects that we work on, again, whether it's criminal justice or other kinds of issues. We've done, before the pandemic, we would do monthly free public events that usually relate to the work that we do. So often that was an opportunity for people to, kind of raise issues and get involved if they were interested in being involved. And so we're going to get in the process of kind of periodically doing more web-based events during the pandemic for people that are interested in helping us in the work that we're doing. But yeah, that's, it's actually very straightforward. We have public events where people get to hear what we have to say and be involved and provide feedback.
Don Lewis asked, how does the philanthropic community maintain the dynamic discussed?
So the philanthropic community is actually pretty central because when I talked about the thought leadership, it is often philanthropy that positions itself as an expert on Black suffering. And so a part of what happens is that philanthropy then is able to curate, which Black voices are given a platform, which Black voices are seen as kind of cutting edge and groundbreaking, And a part of what comes behind that is that, and this sounds really kind of harsh to say, many of the folks who work within philanthropy are not folks that have been immersed in a rigorous study of the history and culture of Black folks, right? They mostly have been taught and trained in the sociology of Black oppression. So these are folks for whom then the kinds of Black folks that they would elevate are Black folks that may be articulate about, conditions of Black suffering, right? And may be able to give you interesting sound bites in terms of thoughts about issues plaguing Black people. But what often happens is that the woeful lack of knowledge around the deep traditions around the work that Black folks have done to address these issues, folks with that knowledge are not lifted up. And let me give an example just to be even more concrete. Baltimore has a tremendous history of building independent Black educational institutions. In 1805 or so, around the early 1800s, the Bethel AME Church established the African Academy that was run by a gentleman named Daniel Coker, who was a missionary. He was a Baptist, an AME preacher, right? Came from New York, came down to Baltimore, established the African Academy that existed until about 1820. One of his students, William Watkins Sr., then established the Watkins Institute in about the early 1850s. And these were institutions where Black folks up and down the East Coast came to study at these institutions. And there is some remnants of the curriculum that they used in teaching many of their students. For folks who are familiar with the history of abolitionism in the United States, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, right, who many people described as like the kind of Black woman contemporary to Frederick Douglass. The Watkins in her name, William Watkins Sr., is her uncle. And she both served as, she was a student and at one point was a teacher at the Institute. In Baltimore, we have a HBCU called Coppin State. Coppin State is named after Fannie Jackson Coppin. Fannie Jackson Coppin, from about 1865 till about 1903 or so, was the director of the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. She wrote a book where she actually was essentially a manual for how to teach. When I've talked to education professionals, particularly in Baltimore, about their approaches to teaching, very few of them have ever read any of the materials that I'm citing. The reason why that's important is because, as I mentioned, there's so much material that comes from Black people about these important issues. And so going back to the question of philanthropy, many of the folks who work in philanthropy don't know any of the examples that I'm naming, right? And I can name many more. And so as a result, what happens is you get Black folks who then are elevated to certain spaces who don't have any of that knowledge. And so they perpetuate then the marginalization of methodologies of liberation. And they often then lift up folks who will perpetuate narratives that constantly render Black folks as inherently pathological, as primarily being an oppressed people. And the reason why I went on with that, because that's really important for people to really understand the dynamics that actually reproduce oppression from folks who sincerely feel like they're trying to push against it. And that's one of the ways that dynamic operates.
Hey, Dayvon, I've got another question from Patty Flowers Colson, who says, some years back, the Search Institute promoted a developmental assets framework for working with youth. Is there any resource in Baltimore that is used that starts with strengths and assets, particularly with youth?
I think that language is emerging. The language of kind of asset-based approaches to community development and human service. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think, asset-based development, though, I think is still limited because I think it's important to identify, like, how is it that assets are being characterized? And without the understanding of the deep resources that the community has that would otherwise be understood as just, you know, a thing, right? So for instance, you know, there are formal and informal communities, for instance, of rites of passage in Baltimore. If one doesn't understand the importance of human socialization that uses some of the technologies that come out of African culture around human development, then it's easy for someone to not understand that as an asset, right? They not understand the value of it. So a part of the point I'm making is, I think, while the shift in asset-based thinking is important, it's important that people have that rigorous exposure to the strengths and intellectual resources and cultural resources of people of African descent, so that when they're looking, they know what to look for, right? When they're looking for certain aspects of a particular youth in the community that they come from, they're able to see things in that community because they have the lens to be able to see it. I would argue a big part of the issue that confronts us is that because of the lack of historical knowledge and context, that folks don't have, in many, again, as well-meaning as they may be, they don't have the ability to see the value in certain things because they wouldn't know.
I have another question that says 2020 has been a very hard year. How has COVID impacted your work?
I mean, as it has for many other people, you know, we have, you know, had to do everything, you know, a lot of things virtually. It's really impacted our ability. You know, we're an organization that prides itself on our approach to community organizing, which is being in the community. And so, you know, we haven't, you know, just for safety precautions, haven't been able to do as much of that as we'd liked to. You know, a lot of times we get asked to talk to students, you know, whether it's, you know, sometimes even like elementary, middle, you know, high school students, college students. And we don't get to do as much of that as we'd like to. You know, and even, you know, DeRay mentioned in his keynote about the importance of in-person, you know, organizing is essential. For LBS, that's a central part of our paradigm and framework around organizing. And so, you know, it's dealt a blow in that regard. You know, but we're still working and we're still, you know, planning and you know, moving the work forward.
All right, Dayvon. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Any final thoughts?
I would say, you know, please follow LBS Baltimore. We're on all your relevant social media. I mean, I can talk briefly about the work that we're currently doing. We're actually very much involved in police accountability, legislative advocacy in Annapolis. And you know, it's going to be very important. I think there's sometimes an assumption that given the moment that we're in as a society, that it should be easy to press for the kinds of legislation we need to really have true police accountability. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. You know, we're going to need people to be helping us to pressure legislators and, you know, public officials to be able to make sure that we can get, you know, truly transformative police accountability legislation. So if you go on, again, all our relevant social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, please follow us, you know, retweet the work that we're doing. Given the pandemic, one of the ways it's definitely going to impact our work is that normally I'm the director of public policy, so I would spend a lot of time in Annapolis. And, you know, the General Assembly, which in Maryland is 90 days from January to April. Normally I'm in Annapolis, you know, 3, sometimes even 4 times a week during session. Session's probably going to be virtual, which impacts our ability to hold them accountable in the ways that we would have otherwise. So that's one thing that actually would be a huge help, is for folks to, again, help to share, retweet, help to just amplify our message, since given the pandemic, that's really our primary mechanism of pressure to get legislators to, pass the legislation that we need to get passed. So I'd say that.
Hey, Dayvon, we got another question when you were talking.
Yep.
This is from Erica Bowman. Says, could you describe any partnerships you've had or sought with prominent white institutions to have tough conversations about how they perpetuate white supremacy and how those conversations went?
It's a very good question. So let me say a couple of things to kind of give some context for my answer. One of the things that I mentioned in the Black paper, the When Baltimore Awakes, excuse me, one of the things I mentioned is that one of the things that LBS experiences in Baltimore are like these whispering campaigns, right? Where, and what I mean is, I'll actually tell a story. A mentor of mine was at a meeting and she called me. She said, Dayvon, I have a stupid question to ask you, but I have to ask this question. She said, Dayvon, do you all work with white people? And of course I laughed and was like, yeah, that's silly. Like, of course we do. She said, Dayvon, I'm at a meeting and people are swearing to me that you all just don't work with white people. And I was like, yeah, that's ridiculous, right? And she was like, I knew that not to be the case, but I just needed to be able to say that I talked to you. I tell that story because, given a lot of the material that I shared this morning, there are a lot of folks who would, because the material is tough, many folks have tried to characterize our perspective in that context of like hating white people or not liking white people. And what I've had to explain in a lot of contexts is that it's not a question of liking or disliking, right? It's a question of making observations about the institutions and how they interact with our communities, right? And so it's not, a personal thing. A white person who feels inspired to want to go help Black people, if they come to our community with these internalized notions of Black pathology and inferiority as the basis for their service in our community, that service is going to be detrimental to our community. And unfortunately, there isn't enough conversation about that for folks to be cognizant of that dynamic. I give that context because these are conversations that we've had in Baltimore in a variety of different settings. And I would say that there's been pretty mixed reactions. I would say that there are some folks, right, white folks included, who have been, who what they do is they don't just take my word for it, but they go look up the resources that I reference. Because one of the things that I'm always very clear about is a lot of these ideas that I'm saying are not original to me. And so when people go and read the resources, it's just clear, right? It's just very clear. And so white folks who take it upon themselves to do that work, many of them become huge supporters of LBS, right? And huge supporters of this perspective for no other reason than they just see the correctness of the perspective. The other reaction we get are people for whom they don't like the perspective we offer, but the issue for them is not so much the perspective, but what the impacts of the perspective is. What the impact is as I mentioned, and I didn't go as much into it, but there are people whose livelihoods and professional advancement is dependent on the status quo being what it is, right? For instance, if Johns Hopkins stopped being the center of gravity of many of the conversations around human development and human service, there are lots of folks who wouldn't have jobs there, lots of folks who wouldn't have the kind of professional trajectory and accolades and status that they have as being folks associated with the institution. And the resources then that are directed to many of the different, pieces or appendages of the Johns Hopkins machine, many of those resources would go elsewhere, right? They go to institutions that folks in our community would own and operate, to be able to really operationalize some of these alternative methodologies. So what happens in many contexts is, and I talked about that avoidance, people who don't like the perspective because they know the impact that it has on a class of people professionally for whom their business model is this kind of exploitative model of Black suffering. And so there's some spaces where LBS is just not invited to in terms of having a conversation. But again, it's been very mixed. And so my hope is that even forums like this, people to encourage folks that they may be in close proximity to get them to have the conversation, use the resources that I provide in the publication When Baltimore Wakes is on our website. Read the text, read the works cited, and have those conversations. But again, there are, white organizations and institutions that have been receptive as a result of just having engaged the material. And that's just work that we'll continue to do. It's not our base. Like our base, LBS's base are Black people in Baltimore. And that's who we speak to most directly. That's what we prioritize in terms of our work. But we definitely see the value in white folks engaging our work. And let me, I know I've kind of gone on. Let me also say one other thing about this too that I think is particularly important. And this is also something I mentioned in the paper. There's often a sentimentality that is associated with these conversations about racial justice. A sentimentality of, I want to be your friend. I want to be liked. I want us to socially be together. And that oftentimes gets conflated with what it actually means to have racial justice. There is an element, particularly certain segments of like the white liberal progressive community, that really desire close proximity to Black people. And this goes back to that Frantz Fanon quote, where it helps them feel good about themselves to say that they're in close proximity to Black people that are doing racial justice work. I've often had to make clear to white folks that are interested in learning is that learning from me or from whoever else in the organization or other Black folks we partner with, it should not be framed of building all these friendly relationships. And that's not to say that, there are white people that I consider friends, but part of the problem is when it gets framed on those terms, it creates a lot of work for folks like me, right? Because I already have a difficult enough time having to do the work in like building my own community. And the kind of emotional pressure that oftentimes gets put on Black folks. Now, there's some Black folks that like it. And there's a very kind of perverse dynamic where even Black folks who are like racially enlightened look for white validation and recognition, right? Even in the context of racial justice, there are Black folks that seek white folks' recognition because that's how we're socialized in the society. LBS doesn't seek that. We don't seek, recognition or validation from white folks. And a part of the sentimentality can be a very unhealthy codependency that is rooted in a lot of these complexes of white supremacy and Black inferiority and Black pathology. And so a reason why I say this is that there are some folks that would describe my style as particularly cold, right, in that kind of area. And what I suggest is that, I can give you the information. I can give you the tools you need. But if I'm being asked to shoulder this kind of emotional, sentimental burden of helping to make white folks feel more involved and feel more connected to racial justice, that's work that white folks have to do for themselves, right? And that's not work that Black folks should do. Black folks who do it, they do it because it gets them access to resources. It gets them access to certain platforms. But it's very important that we don't frame racial justice in that way, because that takes away from what I argue is the real work, which is Black folks are building the institution, the ecosystem of institutions to be self-sufficient and self-determined. The extent to which white folks want to contribute to that effort is certainly welcome. Anything outside of that is tertiary as it relates to racial justice. And again, there are organizations within Baltimore, white organizations, white people, who respect that and who have supported our work in that regard. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dayvon. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
I have a question from John Kern, who asked, in documenting local stories about people struggling with mass incarceration, predatory housing practices, et cetera, how can we avoid repathologizing folks as victims?
Yep. So I'll say a couple of things. One is that I think it's important to understand this as a larger structural piece, right? Which is to say, there is Black oppression, right? So there is mass incarceration, there is gentrification, there is poverty, right? So it's important to understand this as a structural issue where most of the narratives made available about Black people are the narratives that render Black people as a suffering people as pathological. So the first thing I say is just to recognize that as a larger structural thing that as an individual, you may not have the power to do as an individual in terms of addressing that. The second thing I would say is that it's very important, I think, whenever describing the oppression that Black people do face, it's very important that that discussion is framed in terms of the institutions and systems that perpetuate it, right? So sometimes when people do narratives of individual people who have been incarcerated, this actually happens a lot with cases of police brutality where it becomes almost like theater. In fact, one of the folks that I cite in When Baltimore Awakes is Sadia Hartman, who says that white audiences or American audiences consume movies about enslavement. So those movies where you see like the whippings and beatings and whatnot. She says that, and I'm paraphrasing that, American audiences consume these consume narratives of Black oppression the way that people consume horror movies, right? That it's a spectacle and that attention is given to the kind of the spectacle of the oppression, the beatings, the whippings, and what she says is that takes away from the fact that the very structure of the society is violent itself. So I say that to say that I would say it's important to be clear that in talking about mass incarceration, that there isn't the kind of sensationalism of the individual's suffering, like their narrative of suffering. I think some of that's important, but it's important that the emphasis is on the very structures that produce, those particular incidences of the oppression of the criminal justice system or other systems that are oppressive. Focus on the structure itself and not the spectacles of the narratives of suffering. And oftentimes, and I'll say this, oftentimes I've had people encourage folks to basically do the thing that I'm advising against, right? There's a professional interest, I think, for some people to give the most salacious narrative that I'm describing because it's more sellable in that way. And I imagine for some folks, that's a dilemma. If you have a financial interest in selling materials, those kind of spectacular images, spectacular in a negative sense, images of Black suffering are profitable. And that's a decision I think people have to make. But for those who are trying to do differently, focus on the structural aspects of that dynamic and not so much on the things that are really the visuals or the spectacles of that trying to think if that makes sense.
Great, Dayvon. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, for spending all the time with us. A lot of people are very appreciative of what you've done, and we really appreciate Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. You all have a good conference.
All right, so we're going to pivot now to what PeaceTech Lab does, which is media, data, and technology platforms. And so we're going to look at different platforms around the country that are working on economic justice and criminal justice reform, fair housing, evidence-based database policing. So we're going to start with the Opportunity Atlas. Ruby Zhang is from Opportunity Insights, and she's going to be talking about the platform and then what the data layers show for Baltimore. So we'll kick it off with Ruby.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Opportunity Atlas segment of the Road to Equality initiative and meetings. And so I'll be spending the next 10 minutes giving a brief introduction of Opportunity Insights, which is the organization that I'm representing, and some of our main data tools that I think will be really useful for folks who are trying to alleviate problems of economic inequality. And so Opportunity Insights is headed by 3 professors, John Friedman from Brown University, Raj Chetty, and Nathaniel Hendren from Harvard University. All right, so just to begin, I'm gonna give a brief background. So the motivation for Opportunity Insights and the research that we do is to try to solve the question of the fading American dream. Mainly kids now born after 1980, compared to like 5 or 6 decades ago, only half are earning more than their parents. And so this idea of the American dream, the idea of, anyone being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. And so this widening inequality, that's the big question for us. And mainly, what are the sources? What can we do about it? And what are the potential solutions? So as economists, the main tool that we use is data, especially big data. And we analyze a bunch of outcomes and try to see patterns and trends over time to see where we can target initiatives. And then we also analyze a broad range of interventions, of those targeting childhood through adulthood, and try to answer these key questions in a very data-driven way. So a couple of examples of research questions, some which I will definitely dive deeper into since they're related to the data tools that I'll be presenting. So for example, a big one is neighborhoods. That's what the Opportunity Atlas is used for. And something that we're trying to look at is gentrification and place-based investment using the results that the Opportunity Atlas has shown us. Another one is higher education, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So the role of colleges and universities in propelling upward mobility, and mainly how we can measure it, which colleges are doing best. So the main data sources that I'll be presenting for the Opportunity Atlas comes from the United States Census Bureau, as well as IRS. So we've been very lucky in that we've had access to the census data of 20 million Americans through generations. And so we're able to link children to their parents and mainly track how children born to parents in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, how they do later in life. And we can follow them in the neighborhood that they grew up in and also the colleges that they went to. So just to start off, I'm going to be talking about the Opportunity Atlas, which came out a few years ago, and it's been one of the main tools that we use to identify neighborhood level inequality. So this is just a screenshot from the atlas itself. The main concept here that I'd like to introduce that we use to measure upward mobility is the average income of children at age 35 when they're born to parents at the 25th percentile. So parents who are earning $27,000 or less. And of course, this is all inflation adjusted. And the census data allows us to do that by linking children to parents through generations. And so just broadly across the country, we can see that upward mobility, there is very strong geographic patterns and variation. And so, for example, zoning in on Baltimore, if your parent earned on average $27,000 when you grow up, on average, you're going to earn $28,000. And this is compared to places like, for example, Seattle. If you're a parent that is earning on average, you'd be earning $35,000. And so economic opportunity is very in different parts of the country. And that's one thing that the Atlas really illuminated for us. So this is just another scatter and analysis of different cities and looking at their job growth rate, as well as the measure that we looked at before, which is upward mobility. And you can see that in general, there is a negative slope. And over here we have Baltimore, where over the past 20 years, there's been low growth as well as low mobility. Whereas cities that you can compare in the first quadrant has both high mobility and high job growth in the last 20 years. So now that all being said, one big question is, all right, how can we use this data? Where does it live? And so for that, I am going to turn to looking at the actual atlas itself, and I'm going to be spending the next few minutes going through that. All right, so this is a page that is going to takes a few seconds to load up, just given all of the images and vectors that we have. All right, so let's begin exploring. So the atlas, we try to make it as usable as possible. And of course, we always encourage feedback. And if you need help with anything, I'm going to be leaving an email at the end that we address all data concerns and questions too. So here is where we have the Opportunity Atlas, where the map is based off of. So I'm just going to go over a few key things in the map. So first down here, we have a guide. So that is the Atlas user guide, and that does a really great walkthrough of all of the different basic modes of the Atlas and what you can do. So in the Atlas itself, for example, right now we're looking at New York City, and New York City, here what we see the outcome as household income is the outcome for children on this panel. So low-income children, we define that as the 25th percentile for all races and for all genders. And so this means, of course, we can separate it out by both race and gender. So, for example, we can look at the results for Black males who are born to parents at the 25th percentile. And then you can see that now in New York, on average, you'd be earning $25,000. And so it's a lot lower. And then if you separate it out by white males in New York, it'd be $45,000. And so something that we found in general is, and there's a lot more research on it on our website, there's large inequalities and large income gaps between Black and white children, especially for males. And so that gap is especially large, even conditional on being born to parents at the same income percentile. And so here we have for white females born to low-income parents, and then compared to Black females born to low-income parents. And so here we have the toggles, and then you can look at different races, as well as different genders. So I'm going to toggle back to all children of all races born to low-income parents. And here we have a variety of outcomes. So this is just household income, looking at child household income. And so, for example, here we also have the incarceration rate. And the incarceration rate, again, this would be for low-income children. So all children born to parents at the 25th percentile, what is the average incarceration rate? So for example, in Jacksonville, Florida, it's 4.2%, compared to, let's say, like Watertown, New York, where it is slightly less than 1%. And here we have a range of outcomes, and we show them by the scale. And by outcomes, this is all kind of conditional on toggling the sample that you want. And something else to note is we also allow you to change what the color scale shows. So the numbers don't change, but just for ease, this will be toggling to everyone. So this compares to the whole nation, which so it would be the same as toggling to all income for children of all races and all genders. And so for here, if you toggle between everyone and selected group, it would be the same. And so here it would just be comparing for all low-income children. And then on screen, that's because we also allow users to be able to move in, to zoom into, let's say, looking at specific cities or commuting zones. And so these are the outcomes conditional on being born at a certain income percentile or race or gender. So something else that we do is neighborhood characteristics. So for example, here at the commuting zone at the city level, we just have 2. So this is not conditional on, selecting children born at like specific percentiles, since this is just a characteristic of the city. And we pull this from the census data, which is publicly available as well. So now we're going to zoom in on Baltimore. So specifically, let's look at Baltimore, Maryland. And then when you zoom into a place, now you can see everything at the tract level. And this is where the atlas really comes in handy, is that we look at the data at the tract level, so you can literally look at neighborhood differences just a few blocks away. And so here we have, areas of Baltimore that for low-income children living in those areas, where there's relatively higher mobility, so to speak. For example, here in the harbor front versus relatively lower mobility. So something else, for example, that you can really tell from the data is the history of racial segregation in Baltimore. So for example, for a lot of tracts, if we don't have enough data points, if there aren't enough children growing up of that specific background in that tract, then we don't have a data point. And so, for example, you can see that, along the harbor fronts, where it's traditionally like more affluent white families, we don't even have enough data points if we want to look at the mobility rate for low-income Black children, because there weren't any like growing up in that part of the city. And similarly, if you were to toggle to looking at low-income white children, you can see that even for low-income folks, there's a lot of racial segregation in Baltimore, just based on the fact that we don't have data for a lot of these different areas. And so, for example, something else that we can look at is the differences. One, looking at mobility for different races, but also looking at different genders. And I think one of the main uses of the atlas is being able to pinpoint which neighborhoods have higher income mobility for low-income kids and why that's the case. So of course, the goal is to be able to look at neighborhoods and say, hey, these neighborhoods have a higher income mobility. Why is that? and then being able to help policymakers see, where they should make investments, what about certain neighborhoods are allowing higher income mobility, and then of course, what can other neighborhoods do in order to have the same place-based investment that would allow low-income kids to rise out of poverty. And so here, for example, another one is incarceration rate. And unsurprisingly, incarceration rate is heavily correlated with income mobility. And we found that in our data and a lot of the research that we've done. So this is something else that would be relevant to look at in the context of income mobility, economic equality. For example, for low-income Black males in the tract in downtown, the incarceration rate is 33%, whereas just a couple of blocks away, it'll be much lower. And so the fact that we found the same level of variation in these outcomes within a city as we did across the nation for us was very surprising, but also just goes to show how different neighborhoods can be even just within the same city. All right, so this is the Atlas user guide. And just as an addition, folks can also download all of the data. So first of all, you can take screenshots. So you can zoom in, play with the toggles, take screenshots to use in your own presentation as long as we're credited. And then you can also download the data, select which variables you want, maybe all of the variables, select which subgroup, and we can also do it by all the subgroup. And we have the data glossary, the full data sets, as well as the shape files that we use for the tract. So then that way folks can download all of the data that we've put together, make their own figures, do their own analysis. The goal is for this to be as open source as possible. And finally, I'm gonna go back to the presentation. I'm gonna go back to the presentation. So that is an overview of the Atlas. All right, so the next tool that I'm going to spend a little time showing is the economic tracker, which we've put together and we're still in the process of building. So the economic tracker is a real-time tracker of all sorts of economic indicators, including consumer spending, small business revenue, unemployment wages, and we've aggregated all of this data from a variety of private sector partners. So this includes MasterCard, Paychex, Intuit, Burning Glass. So very different from using administrative census data, just because with private sector data, we have daily updates. And since with the pandemic, everything is moving so quickly, we found it especially relevant for folks to have the most updated data. And so this is where that tool lives, tracktherecovery.org. Let me just switch to that. So this is where it will take you. And just as a home screen, for all of these indicators, we have them at the national, the state. For example, you can toggle a different state, the county. So this is within Maryland. And then of course you can choose which counties in which states you want to look at, and then at the metropolitan level. And so, for example, let's go to small business revenues. So for small business revenues, we're now at Baltimore. So overall, for small businesses in Baltimore, as of September 20th, 2020, they've taken nearly a 30% hit in revenue compared to the year before. So just for context, all of the series that we use in the economic tracker, in order to have some sort of benchmarking, we norm it both to January 2020, and then in order to take out any like yearly fluctuations, for example, if something specifically happened in a particular year, we then benchmark that again to 2019. So then here, really what you're seeing is the negative 30% is what it should have been compared to the year before and the beginning of the year. And we also provide all of the different stay-at-home orders, and public school closings that's relevant to each state, just so people can have a context of when things happened. And so that is for total small business revenue. So here, this is looking at education and health services. Here, if we're to look at leisure and hospitality especially, has taken a really hard hit. So even now, it's down by negative 56% compared to what you would have expected at this time of the year. And retail and transportation has done slightly better, only taken a decrease of 4% of what you would have expected. And so something that we found in the papers that we've put out with this data is, a lot of low-income workers tend, especially those who are in leisure, hospitality, and like service industries, have taken also an especially hard wage cut as well. And so if anything, the result of COVID has really made inequality worse. And all those papers are available on our website. So this is looking at the small business revenue. For example, for Burner and Glass, we also look at job postings, seeing like how that's changed by the type of job postings that are there by industry and also by required education. We have unemployment claims, online math participation from Zern. So this is just to look at how students are doing, but of course, schools kind of closed by May, and so that's where our data goes until. And of course, public health, which is COVID-19 cases. So this is looking at Baltimore. So 8 new reported cases per 100,000 people. So there was a spike in the summer, and now it's gone down. But it seems like, with the coming fall, it might be going back up again. And then time spent outside home. So this is definitely not as granular as the Atlas, but it still provides a good context of breaking things down within the city, seeing which industries are most impacted, comparing it to other cities. So you can also compare it to other metropolitan areas, for example, in Indianapolis or here in Boston. And here allows you to add charts. So if you click add chart, let's say I want the employment series, that way you can have, side-by-side comparisons. We also allow people to download the charts as well as download the data that we have as well. And that'll take you to an online repository where we store all of this data and numbers. Again, people can use it to do their own analysis, their own comparisons. And that's what we're hoping for people to do. And here on the menu, we have links just to introduce folks to the data documentation, describing what we do on the tracker, and similarly providing a user guide. All right, so those are kind of the 2 crash courses of the 2 big tools that we've really put out for public use, and we're hoping, would be as useful as possible to other researchers, to policymakers, to anyone who might be interested in looking at all of these outcomes. So I guess in the few spare moments we have, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we've actually used the data and these tools to put forward concrete policy proposals. And so we kind of have 3 pillars. So one is reducing segregation. So this is conditional, on governments spending an X amount of dollars on housing vouchers. The goal is we want to help folks move to places that are as high opportunity as possible. So that's an initiative that we already started in Seattle called CMTO, Creating Moves to Opportunity. Now, of course, a natural question is, now that being said, ultimately you want to invest in these places. You want to look at neighborhoods where mobility is low and ask, why is mobility low in this neighborhood? What can we do for this neighborhood? And so that's still an ongoing branch of research. So the first one is, identifying places. And second, there's all sorts of projects that are going on with policy, with the econ research team side, to look at different factors and determinants. And then the last pillar is improving education. So the impacts of college on mobility. So this is, as we said, Creating Moves to Opportunity. We've launched in Seattle. We're currently working with a bunch of other municipal governments as well, their housing departments, so that they can best allocate the funds that they're devoting to housing vouchers to help families move to high opportunity areas. And so next, I'm going to talk a little bit about college and upward mobility. So the two main things that we care about is access. Does a school serve low-income students? And second, success. So for low-income students who do attend the school, do they achieve economic security in the long term? Are they able to move up the socioeconomic ladder? And this is where we use the IRS tax data to follow students over 20 years. And so that data, we don't have a map for it, but what we do have is a data repository on our website. So our website is opportunityinsights.org, and we have a section called data. So under that section, not only were we able to find the data that I presented in the Opportunity Atlas in table format, but we also have the data sets for college, and specifically, which colleges actually promote the best upward mobility, conditional on also providing access to low-income students. So for example, elite colleges and universities don't do a very good job in terms of upward mobility, because even though they propel low-income students who do attend to the top percentiles, the access rate is very low. And so that would give them a relatively low score on the upward mobility front. And then finally, if there are any questions that folks have about any of the tools, the data sources, if we have any other data that we might help with in terms of education, neighborhood, socioeconomic inequality, please contact us at info@opportunityinsights.org. One of the research fellows is always manning the info inbox, and we're always really happy to help and hear from folks who might be interested in using the data that we have. So thank you so much, and feel free to contact the info inbox if you have any further questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Ruby. We're waiting on Renee Mitchel from RTI International to talk to us about evidence and database policing, but we want to look at right now a really good resource for organizations in Baltimore, which is the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And we just have a 5-minute little short presentation on that, and then we'll be getting Renee to talk to you about evidence and database policing.
Video is meant to introduce anyone to the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the Jacob Frantz Institute, University of Baltimore. We have been collecting data and disseminating community-based indicators for all of Baltimore's neighborhoods since 2000. First, let's try to understand what community-based indicators are and how they can be useful to neighborhoods. Community-based indicators are bits of information that, when compiled together, reflect what's going on in a local area. The indicators don't define a place, but help us all better track the quality of life in all of Baltimore's neighborhoods and the direction a neighborhood might be going in. Trends in the indicators can help community members see if their neighborhood is going in a positive direction or potentially in a negative direction. Community-based indicators are unique because they are driven by what community members themselves are interested in knowing about their neighborhoods, so that they can use a data-driven advocacy approach to influencing policy outcomes in the public sector. Communities are like organic systems, interconnected through economic, social, and environmental forces that act upon them. The indicators are used to provide common understanding of how the neighborhoods are faring. That's why we do what we do. The Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance is a project at the University of Baltimore, and we serve as a one-stop shop for comprehensive indicators for neighborhoods in Baltimore. We work with a variety of nonprofits, universities, and governmental agencies to ensure that the data we collect, analyze, and disseminate is useful and actionable at the community level. BNIA, as we are known locally, is a partner in the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a network of cities organized by the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. This network is the outgrowth of a movement that began in the early 1990s to make sure that information was taken out of city agencies and put into the hands of neighborhood leaders so that the information could be equally used for actionable results. The tagline at the time was democratization of data so that everyone had access to the same information. So what exactly do? We spend a lot of time coordinating with city agencies to acquire relevant data that can be processed and analyzed to calculate community-based indicators. City-based data exist in what are known as administrative data sets, information that exists to serve some public administrative purpose, such as everyone who requests a permit to rehabilitate a home, or someone who calls 311 to initiate a service request, or someone who has reported a crime. Here are some of the data sets that we collect from various city agencies, such as the police department, the city stat office, and the public school system. We integrate the various data sets into one master database and use geographic information systems to visualize the data on our website. Community-based indicators are aggregated to small geographies called Community Statistical Areas, or CSAs. These areas are aggregations of census tracts from the 2010 census and are roughly aligned with how communities define their neighborhoods. We produce more than 110 indicators for all of the city's CSAs in our annual Vital Signs report, which shows the latest year's indicators across 8 topic areas, such as housing and community development, sustainability, and crime and safety. Every community receives a community profile that shows the results of their indicators over time. We work with the communities across the city to understand what the latest profile is telling them about the trends in their neighborhood. Even though the indicators might be in a specific section of the Vital Signs report, each indicator can be used to reflect a broader topic. Let's say, for instance, you are interested in accessibility and how people are able to move in and out of their neighborhood. One indicator best suited to address the idea, what % of commuters in a neighborhood spend more than 45 minutes getting to work? Each one of the indicators in Vital Signs is available as a map online at our website. The darker the color on each map, the higher the value of that indicator. You and other users need to determine if a high value in an indicator is a positive or a negative attribute. In this case, we might all agree that a higher value an indicator is showing long commute is a negative attribute. Too many people in your neighborhood are spending too much time getting to work. Another broad topic area is community health, and you might choose something like life expectancy as the indicator to reflect that idea. Here, the higher the value and the darker the color, a positive attribute of a neighborhood is shown. The values of the indicators and the colors on the map help to tell us the variation in life expectancy. In Baltimore, we have some neighborhoods with life expectancy as low as 65 years, and just a few miles away, we have neighborhoods with a life expectancy as high as 84.4 years. That's a difference of 20 years. So we welcome you to read the Vital Signs report and to visit our website to download the data and community profiles for your neighborhoods that you are interested in. There are interactive maps and a space for communicating with others of BNIA data in our learning community. So please visit our website at www.BNIA-JFI.org. The data will help you learn more about Baltimore's neighborhoods and will inspire you to join in on the common goal of achieving a better quality of life in every neighborhood.
All right, so that's BNIA, and I put the link up for that if anybody wants that. All those data sources are updated through 2020. Now I want to introduce Renee Mitchel, who's a senior police researcher at RTI International. And I had seen her on CNN and thought she would be perfect for this. So So with that, I'll just turn it over to Renee, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm probably going to switch back and forth. And I'm not the most techie person in the world. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit. And I just want to make sure too, are you guys hearing me okay? There's no feedback or anything like that?
Sounds good.
Okay, good. So let me see if it'll let me share my screen. Hang on one sec. There we go. It's not like, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Will it let me do it? I think you have to give me permission.
Try it now, Renee. Sorry about that.
That's okay. In this day and age of Zoom, I figure we're all learning. And we gotta be gentle and kind, right? Except you guys still are seeing me, aren't you?
No, we can see this. We can see your presentation.
Okay, good. So I put together a short PowerPoint just to go over a couple things about some of the data-driven approaches for understanding the role of police better. As Tim said, I'm a senior researcher at RTI International. I also run the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. So our society, it's a nonprofit organization. We're actually open to membership. You could be a community member, a professor, a student. It's complete transparency. What we try to do is translate the research that's out there for the layperson to really, because what we've seen with journal articles is a lot of times the methods part, or even just the acronyms, like it's not user-friendly, I guess, in a way for the, the reader that just wants to learn about policing and research. So we, at the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, we translate it into a two-page brief. So people, if they want to learn about police practices that have been tested, they could get those briefs. We also have a partnership with Justice Clearinghouse that gives webinars on all things policing, which is another great resource for people. But there's a lot of tools nowadays for community members to look at what the police are doing in their areas. Most police departments actually put a lot of their data on their websites. They put their crime data. A lot of them are moving to where their officers are doing their proactive activity out in the field. So there's ways to use the tools and the data to examine what exactly are the police doing in your community. And also, I was a police officer for 22 years in the Sacramento Police Department. So when I'm speaking about a lot of times like what police officers do, I'm speaking both from my experience and as an outside researcher. And I always tell people, I was a cop for 22 years, but I was also a Sacramento Police Department cop. So that means like I know my agency really well. I know Sacramento really well. So sometimes people, I've done interviews before where they will ask me questions about these type of incidents that they've seen. And for me, I think I just got really lucky that I worked in a really good agency that had a really good internal affairs department. And I was always trained to treat people really well. So some of my experience, over the 22 years is I felt like we had a really professional police organization, and I got really lucky. Because like I said, had I had some of those experiences, I probably wouldn't have lasted for 22 years. But for RTI, we are a nonprofit research organization. We've been around since 1950. We were set up by 3 different universities. So Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and then North Carolina State University came together and decided to develop a nonprofit research institute. So besides doing police research, we have research across the board for all different types of issues. I've only been with RTI since January, so I couldn't even tell you half the research we do. But what we do in my area, it's applied police research. So we try to look at what the officers are doing in the field, and how that impacts the community, how that impacts crime. And some of our focus areas are, as you can see on the screen, you know, the justice, safety, and resilience, race and health equity, victimization, victim services. We advocate for evidence-based policing strategies. We do investigative science, agency workforce, workplace challenges, law enforcement, communities, and victims. So some of the research we have going on right now, we have, you know, we're looking at health and wellness apps that the officers use out in the field. We're looking at the recruitment and retention of female officers, because the research shows that the more female officers you have on your force, they actually use less force than their male counterparts. So we have research going on in that area. We are currently, another project we have is a calls for service analytics software project. So RTI has created a calls for service analytics software where both for the officers driving the vehicles and for the calls that are coming in, it analyzes all the calls that are coming in on a daily basis, and it shows the police chiefs how many calls are coming in when they have the highest workloads. And if there is the AVL data in the vehicles, it can show where the officers are in the field at any moment in time. And you could show within the software, you can show when they're driving faster than 20 miles per hour, when they're going over 20 miles per hour. So you could get an idea of, you know, the difference between when an officer, and I'm not saying like speeding through your neighborhood, but more like when they're not patrolling it, they're not there to try to find any kind of stops or traffic enforcement. They're probably going to a call or something like that, versus when they're driving very slowly and you could tell that they're trying to do some type of proactive enforcement. And then you could also use a system to look at when they are en route to a call or coming off on a call. And all of these tools are really just good data to have, because you could tell like what the officers collectively are doing. And some of the issues that we're having, you know, that you see across the United States is, I've been saying for a while now, is that we collectively as a profession have to get away from our independent contractor model of policing. So currently, officers, the way we're set up is we go into roll call, we get our assignment, and then we go out and patrol really where we want to patrol between calls for service. Depending on the agency you work for, you could be so busy that some officers would probably say, well, what do you mean it's an independent, you know, contractor model? I'm so busy, I go call to call to call to call, which can be true. I've had those days, I've had those areas of my city where that is all I do. But there's also those days of the week and those months of the year where you're not as busy. And so between calls for service, you're patrolling where you want, and then you're also looking to arrest for the crimes you want. And what I mean by that is, you know, back in the 80s and 90s, you might be looking to make a drug arrest. You might know where the known prostitution stroll is, so you go down there and you're looking to make that type of arrest. Or you have information on parolees, so you're looking to make that type of arrest. So officers tend to develop this skill set of either what they're good at finding or what they enjoy finding. And that's what I mean by like an independent contractor model, is there's no focused from the executive management down saying, here's how we're going to approach the city or the neighborhood as a collective whole for this shift, for this week, for this month. So something like the calls for service data analytics tool, that is something that could shift from this independent contractor model into a more of an executive management model of managing where the officers are and what they're doing. So we also have, as I was saying, our Center for Policing Research and the Investigative Science. So on the investigative science side, I'm sure people have seen, you know, the CSI shows. That's more of our forensics side, looking at all of the ways that we could develop the tools and the technology to advance our sciences. So that way we make sure that, you know, we're solving crimes faster, we're finding suspects faster, because we want to make sure that we're taking care of the victims on the victim side. One of our projects we have right now that we have funded. It was going to be following up on burglary victims, but due to COVID, we couldn't make, the research project couldn't turn into what we had originally had envisioned for it. So now we're creating a chatbot, and we've named her Eva because she's an enhanced victim advocate. So the idea is, if you can't send out somebody to follow up with the burglary victims, can we build a bot that police departments can use, and she can answer all of the, if victims have questions and follow-up questions, can she answer some of those questions and make it really easy and simple for victims after a burglary if they have follow-up questions? Because those are the things that we see in policing quite a bit is, you know, there's traumatic fallout when somebody is a victim of a crime, and often we don't have those resources. But nowadays we have the technology and we have people who are really smart. And we've advanced so far in the last 20, 30 years that we could build these type of things for victims to where we could help them with the process. So this is our focus areas. It's a little repetitive from the beginning, but the data-driven applications, really looking at, workforce and workplace challenges, the investigative sciences I just kind of went over. But we're also really, the other thing that we have going on, and I'm horrible with slides, I create them every time, but then I get ahead of myself, is we have a big project going on with the North Carolina cities. There's almost 6 or 7 different cities where we're working with the city personnel rather than the police departments, trying to help them use their data to drive their decision making. So there's been a lot of outcry about defund the police, and most of the defund the police conversations seem to be coming from this emotional reaction of I'm angry and I'm upset, and here's all the reasons why I believe we shouldn't have police involved with the community anymore. But really, and we've seen this in Minneapolis already, that the Minneapolis City Council, half of them were on board for, yes, let's defund the police, let's find a new way of doing things. And the minute they started shutting down the officers going out and dealing with some of their crime issues, you have their violence and the shootings ramping up, and you have victims coming forward saying, you cannot take our police away, this is what keeps us safe. So there's a balance there. You have to figure out ways to keep your community safe, but not over police and not damage the relationships you have. So we're working with these cities in North Carolina to examine their data, to look at, first of all, you have to look at what type of calls are coming in. So when people were advocating for defund the police, they weren't examining their data first to say, okay, if we're going to have some type of mental health advocate go out, well, how many calls are even mental health related? And then of those calls, how many of them, have a weapon? And of those calls that don't have weapons, how many of them have violent behavior? And then how many of those calls that they don't have violent behavior might you need to still put somebody, in California we call it 5150 hold, but put them on a mental health hold, which is really the only person that can do that is a police officer, is to take them into custody. And even when you get around all of that, so then you get down to this set of calls. So say of, whatever percent of calls you have, let's say you have 50% of those that a mental health professional could answer. Well, then you have to look at your workforce. Do you have mental health professionals available that wanted to work in the field, that they wanted to go out by themselves, or maybe with a police officer, and they wanted to work in the field with the mentally ill? Because that might not be the lifestyle that they saw for themselves. That when they became a mental health professional, they saw themselves in an office working with the mentally ill, or in a hospital, or those type of environments. So switching into this new environment, you might not have a workforce that's ready to take on that role out in the field, and you might not have a workforce that's ready to deal with when things don't work out the way you think they will when somebody's having a mental health issue. So we're working with the agencies to really examine their data. Then once you figure out once you figure out what all your data shows, then examining the evidence. What research do we have to show that certain approaches are effective or certain approaches are efficient? Then let's start applying those interventions. And when we start applying those interventions, are there ways that we could set up a research design to actually determine if those outcomes are effective and efficient? Because often in policing, what we do is binary percent changes. Is we say, oh, crime's going up, we did something, crime's going down, it must have worked. But if you look at data and statistics, if you understand data, you understand that there's random variation and fluctuations within data. And if you're just looking at small snapshots, like weekly data sets of crime or calls for service, you're going to get this random fluctuation. So if you do an intervention at some point in there and you don't have a large data set, you're going to essentially be examining random fluctuations, and you're going to be unsure if it's really your intervention that made the crime come down or if it was just the crime regressing to the mean, is what it's called. But this is something that we're trying to help. As I said, it's the city leadership that is working with RTI versus the police department. And I think in some ways that's not a bad approach, because then you're giving the police department a level of space to where it's not the police department making the decisions. So when the community is upset or doesn't agree with how the strategy is being rolled out, they have a level of distance, which I think is helpful, at least for right now while you're trying out these new things. And the idea really is that you want to create this, community of safety, engagement, and trust. And these are all the things that really go into building that, and the outcome measures that we want to look at. So you want to look at the community socio-demographics that you have in your community. You want to look at your use of force incidents that are going on in your police department. You want to look at the law enforcement characteristics, like what is the race breakdown of your police department? What is the gender breakdown of your police department? How diverse are you? What type of proactive community engagement is your police department engaging in? What are the levels of reported crime and calls for service? And then what are the community responses? Because the other thing we know from the research is really that crime and calls for service is fairly stable. If you map out your city's crime and calls for service by street segment, not kernel density mapping, but if you map by street segment and you map 3 years of data versus 1 year of data versus 90 days of data, it'll probably all look the same. You're going to show that crime really doesn't move much. It's in the same areas, it's generational. So instead of patrolling your whole city and doing proactive engagement throughout the whole city, it's better just to focus on the areas that are having those kind of problems, because it's a community issue and it's a societal issue that stems from the environment that is occurring there. And there's all kinds of things that occur in that environment, but you have data that'll tell you where that's coming from. So it's a matter of examining that data and then looking at how do we intervene to make the neighborhood or whatever, how do we change that? How do we change 20, 30, 40 years of crime and calls for service and make it better? One of the tools that we have that's available online is our STAR Statistical Traffic Analysis Report. This is a lot of times what you'll see is when people report out on traffic stop data, what they will do is do population data. And they'll say, this police agency stopped this many African Americans, like 15% of African Americans, but the population only has 8%. So that shows that there's, implicit bias, there's disparate contacts. But population data, there's a whole guide by Lori Friedel out of the University of Florida that talks about the different benchmarks. And one of the worst ones is population data. It's just not a very good measure of what is occurring if you're going to look at bias, right? So this Veil of Darkness study was done by Groger and Ridgway, the two researchers that looked at, okay, if we're going to examine traffic stops and we're going to look at if is race a disparate contact issue, then we don't want to look at population. We want to look at like who's being stopped when. So they came up with the idea of looking at the stops during daylight versus darkness. So the theory behind it is if it's dark, you really can't tell the race of the person driving or who's in the car. So your stops at the same time when it's light should be the same breakdown when it's dark. And the nice thing about the STAR tool is that it's online. If you just Google STAR Statistical Traffic Analysis Report, it's online. And if you have your police department's data, so if you have the date and the time and the race, like to dump in on an Excel spreadsheet, it'll run it for you. So the nice thing is with a very little bit of amount of data, you know, you could run this with your police department, or you should be able to ask your police department to do this, and hopefully they're transparent enough and willing to be a little introspective that they should run this themselves and report back to say, hey, this is what we found. Because a lot of this stuff, it shouldn't be used as, oh my gosh, you're a horrible agency and you have horrible police officers. It should be used as a learning tool to say, hey, this is data and it gives you information. And we're not going to judge you for it, but we would like to see how you're going to use that data to improve on what you do. It's what most professions do, so it's something that we should be doing also. This is a project I was telling you a little bit about, the NC cohort of cities. So like I said, it's pretty much all the cities. We're breaking it down, and this is what it looks like. So using the calls for service, to see how they're coming in, standardizing how we look at it, how we're going to analyze those calls for service data, and then inventory all those calls. The other thing, they've done studies, in this they're going to convene working groups, but there is a really good article that looked at the crossover between EMS and fire, and they've shown that the crossover there for calls for service is about 30% for most cities. So you really have this opportunity to take a big portion of your calls for service and probably triage it in a way that can reduce either your police citizen contact or reduce, the waste of having a fire department going out. But there's ways to reduce some of the waste in some sense. And the idea behind this also is to reduce that police citizen contact. Because if we could still keep our cities safe, keep your crime down, keep your calls for service down, keep your citizens happy, because a lot of citizens still want the police to come when they call, and that is a service the cities provide, then you still want to make sure that you're reducing, like if you're reducing that contact with the police, you still want to keep all these things like in balance, right? You don't want to reduce contact and then have crime go up. You don't want to reduce contact and have your mentally ill, becoming victims because they're out unprotected. So at the end of this, the idea is to really reduce your low-level misdemeanor arrests, like maybe arrests that really don't need to occur, reduce your complaints, and reduce your use of force. And this is, like I said, this is the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. That's our website on the bottom. And besides the American Society, there's a Canadian Society, there is a British Society, and an Australian New Zealand Society. So this is what we all advocate for, is the use of research in policing. This is something that I see that it's starting to take hold here in America. It is advanced much more in other countries that have more centralized policing than we have here in the US. But I think here in the US, there's a lot of police chiefs that are starting to understand what evidence-based policing is, and to want to understand the research and want to test some of their practices. So to me, it's getting some traction, which I think like this cohort of NC cities is where you're starting to see now with what we have going on in the US is police departments and police chiefs are really reaching out to say, we've stood on the back of tradition for too long. And so now we are willing to take a look at the research and the data to drive our police practices and our strategies. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Renee. That was very fascinating. And I know you have to run, but people can email you, correct, if they have any questions about the presentation?
Oh yeah, definitely. And feel free to, I'm on Twitter too. So I answer all kinds of questions on Twitter. My husband makes fun of me, but I've got all kinds of Twitter friends that I love to follow and I love to exchange information with. But yeah, any questions on email, feel free. Or if you want articles too, I often share articles with people when they find something that they think is interesting and they want more information on. I will help anybody with anything they need.
All right. Thank you, Renee. I appreciate your time today.
No, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. All right. So I want to just quickly, before we've got one more presentation for the day, but I want to tell you quickly about next week and what to expect. We have a range of trainers coming in. I think we have 8 trainers in all, media training, messaging apps, mapping tools, digital security, data analysis tools and visualization, a lot of different areas. And we'll send those sessions around. What you need to be thinking about before next week is we're going to be doing 2 training sessions for you. So you'll pick 2 that you want to learn about and join trainers and do hands-on training with your laptops, with your cell phones. So we'll send all those around this week, but just be thinking about what you want to train on, and we'll record the other ones so you can watch those as well. Our last session of the day is from Measures of Justice. So we have Dr. Mikaela Rabinowitz and Shelby Davis from Measures for Justice talking about data in the criminal justice reform space. And I know a lot of you are focused on that, so we really appreciate your time and for joining us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. So I am Mikaela Rabinowitz, and I'm here with my colleague Shelby Davis. And as Tim mentioned, we are from Measures for Justice. We are a nonprofit criminal justice research organization, and our goal is to collect and put into the public domain data around the criminal process and how it's operating in such a way that people working within and across the system can understand how what's going on in their county and their state compares to what's happening in other jurisdictions across the country, with the idea being that without the information about how the justice system is performing, it's hard to identify the areas where reform is most needed, but that with that data in hand, both policymakers and advocates have the information that they need to help drive the reforms that are necessary to create a more fair and more equitable criminal justice system. So we are currently working on a project called 20 States by 2020, which means that by the end of this year, we will have put criminal justice data from 20 states, about 1,500 counties on our free online data portal. So what we're going to do just for the next couple of minutes is Shelby is going to show people kind of what the data portal looks like and how different issues, both statutorily and technologically related to criminal justice data availability, affect how much the public is actually able to access information about how their own criminal justice systems are performing. And then I'll talk a little bit about how learning more about the criminal justice data landscape across the country has informed the work that we are now doing.
Great, great. And then I'll go ahead and share my screen if I've got, let's see. Share. Oh, sorry guys, some technical issues. Let's see.
Made you a co-host, so it should be available, but let me know if it's not.
Okay. Let's try again. There we go. All right, can everyone see that? Yes, okay, great. All right, so thank you, Mikaela. And yeah, I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly because we only have a short time together today. I won't really dive into all of the measures or features on our portal, but we're hoping maybe to have time for a few questions, or I know we would love for you all to take some time after today and maybe take a deeper dive into what you see here and let us know what you think. So here we are on the portal homepage, and I wanted to go ahead and go through a few states to kind of illustrate some of those, how some of those challenges and barriers kind of show up for us. So the first state I'm going to take us to is actually our pilot state of Wisconsin. And I chose Wisconsin first because when compared to other states, there were relatively few barriers here. And before I jump in, I should note that for all of these states you see on the portal and all of those coming this year, the measures are populated by court data. So in Wisconsin, trial court data is centralized. It's all housed and maintained by the state court. And the data can be requested through this sort of formalized process that the court established, which involves a data sharing agreement and access to their case level database. So in addition to having a clear process outlined for researchers, the court tracks the majority of elements necessary to populate our measures. And we can see that here we have 30 measures for the state of Wisconsin. I'm going to go ahead and choose a measure to take a deeper look at. Let's do time to disposition for misdemeanors. Go ahead and do that. So when we click into this measure, we can see that for this 2011 to 2015 cohort, and we can look either as this bar graph or as a heat map here, but whichever way you look, in Wisconsin, the median time to disposition for misdemeanors was 109 days. And we can also, because Wisconsin's court data was so robust and we were able to collect so many data elements, we can also filter by all of these things at the top. So we can also filter this measure by, say, race. And when we do that, we can see that in Wisconsin, the median time for disposition involving defendants of color was greater than white defendants by a ratio of 1.07 to 1. So a bit of a racial disparity there. Interestingly, we have two pretty extreme looking outliers on either end. So that would be a point. If we had more time, I would love to take a deeper dive into that, or if folks are particularly interested in racial disparities, that could be a great place to look further. So I'm going to jump to another state. Let's go to one of our new states of North Dakota. And North Dakota, the data isn't quite as robust as in Wisconsin. We can see here that we have 14 measures compared to Wisconsin's 30. And there were some pretty significant limitations here. So let's go back to that measure we were looking at. In Wisconsin, let's see, where are we? Time to disposition for misdemeanors. So we can see in North Dakota, that median time, it's much lower. It's 35 days. And we can also go up here and see that some of our filters are missing. Now, one of the challenges in North Dakota was that the court simply doesn't track race or indigency status. So we can see that we are a little limited in what we can say about racial patterns when it comes to the North Dakota data. Data collection practices in a state can certainly be one challenge for us. So let me see if I can squeeze one more example. I know I'm going super fast. Let's look at Missouri. This is my home state. And we can tell almost immediately when we navigate to Missouri that there are only 3 measures available. And unlike in North Dakota, this isn't so much about data collection practices as much as it's about sort of the laws governing the release of the data. So in Missouri, the court is prohibited from releasing data related to any case that didn't result in a conviction. So that severely limits what we can do with the data. And as you can see, if we go back to our performance measures here, we can't even look at that time to disposition. We only have a few measures here. So there's a lot of variation, and I know that was really quick, but hopefully it gives you a bit of background into, and a few examples of the challenges we face and sort of the implications of those challenges and how they show up as we kind of try and bring transparency to the criminal justice system. And I'm gonna pass it back to Mikaela to close us off here.
Great, thanks so much, Shelby. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we started this project, 20 states by 2020, really with the goal of making high quality, easy to understand data available to the general public so that folks could actually, in the states and counties where they live, have access to the information they needed to drive reform, to identify issues requiring reform, and then act on those issues. Over time, one of the things that we have learned is that the issues that Shelby identified actually preclude the general public from having access to information about how the public systems that our tax money pays for are operating. And there are a variety of different issues that preclude access, including the quality of data, things like decisions being made either at the state level or at the local level around what data to collect and how to collect it, and then laws and regulations related to the access to the data that are collected. And so increasingly, and not exclusively, but increasingly our work now is focused not only on collecting and putting forth the data that are available, but also to documenting what the issues are that are precluding access to that information, and helping, again, advocates, policymakers, and practitioners understand what are the both legal and technological changes that are required to improve criminal justice data collection, quality, and availability across states and counties in the United States. So we have worked on a couple of different legislative projects toward that end. In 2018, we worked on legislation in Florida related to the collection of comprehensive criminal justice data, as well as the access to that data. In California, in 2019, we worked on legislation specifically related to court data and court data access. And we're working on a number of related projects across the country to ensure that the public does have access to the information about how the systems that we are paying for are operating. In addition, we are increasingly working to not only put forth information about the data, but to put forth not only put forth information about how the system is operating based on the data, but to actually put forth information about data access. And so through that, we're developing a site called the State of the Data. You can access that site through the Measures for Justice site that Tim noted, and then you can use that to understand what the data laws and regulations are in the state that you are working on. I noticed a question about data in Maryland. So we do not currently have data on Maryland. Maryland does have a centralized court data system, which is a critical step towards being able to get the data. As far as we have seen to date, there's not a streamlined, clear, and easy to access process for the public or for researchers to access that information. And so one of the challenges that we see in Maryland is the access around data access. And without really understanding the data access issues, we can't even start understanding the data quality yet. But what I would say is that for those of you working on reform in Maryland, that should be one of the core questions that you are asking the prosecutors in your state, the court offices in your state are around what the data are that they are collecting, and how you, as members of the public who are paying for those services, can access that information.
All right, are there any other questions for Mikaela or for Shelby? All right, I'm not seeing any, but we're going to record all of these sessions and share them around so people can go back and rewatch them and share them with their colleagues. I guess with that, we will close the day for the Road to Equal Justice, and really thank you, Mikaela and Shelby, for joining us and showing us this fascinating platform. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.